Shabbat Shalom. Pop quiz time. Everybody enjoys that, I am sure. You are all getting ready for Pesach, yes? Excellent. What's on your Seder plate? A shank bone, absolutely. And the shank bone is there because? Because of the lamb, right? Because of the sacrifice that we offered first in Egypt itself, and then, of course, throughout the years, annually for Pesach, we would offer the Pesach offering, which was a lamb. And in commemoration of that sacrifice, we still have a shank that goes on the Seder plate. Excellent, you get a gold star. What else we got on that plate? What's that? Matzah, I thought I heard somebody say. Absolutely. We've talked before about the argument of whether you have 2 sheets of matzah or 3 sheets with 1 broken. I can fill anyone in who wants to know more about that during the Kiddush. But matzah is absolutely necessary. I will point out some people put it on the plate, under the plate, next to the plate. Depends on how your plate was designed. But yes, absolutely we need matzah. I heard somebody else shout out, but I missed it. Okay, wow, everybody's on this one. Parsley, right. Karpas. And why do we have the karpas? Spring. It is spring, right? That is the hors d'oeuvre. We dip our karpas in order to awaken our appetite, just as spring is awakening. Because we're going to come back to that matzah, and not many people hit matzah with an appetite if they are left to their own devices. That is to say, we are purposely trying to increase our hunger so that we will be willing to eat matzah joyfully. Because that is the whole point of Pesach, is going from suffering to joy. And when what you're looking forward to is a piece of matzah, it takes extra effort to get you to that point of joy. So the karpas is there to facilitate that transition by literally making us hungrier. Right? Appetizers are there to make you hungrier, not to fill the hunger. What else we got on the plate? Maror. And maror is, of course, the bitter herbs. And again, I can also point out to those who would like to have this conversation that horseradish does not count. I know that that is going to really ruin a lot of traditions from Eastern Europe where nothing was growing at that time. But welcome to living in Florida. Everything's growing constantly, whether you like it or not. And that means that we do have access to actual herbs and not roots. And as the Mishnah and Halacha makes clear, roots are not supposed to cut it for maror. And indeed, horseradish itself doesn't even give you the right flavor because it is harif, it is spicy, it is not bitter. So we can talk about that for those that would like to wrangle over our food, but maror is there for bitterness because we were bitter. We must have at least some taste of the bitterness that our ancestors felt. Absolutely. All right, so we've got our shank bone, we've got our parsley, we've got our bitter herbs, we've got our matzah. What else is still on that plate? Eggs, I heard. I saw another hand. What? Eggs. Everybody's got the eggs. Good. But there's one more thing before we get to the egg. Haroset. Haroset. Haroset is, it depends on the recipe of your family, but it is a sweet, mud-like looking substance, which is there, why? For the maror, for the bitter herbs, in order that we will dip. That is the second dipping of the Seder that we talk about in Manish Tana, where we say we dip twice. The first dip is, of course, the karpas, the parsley. The second dipping is the bitter herb into the haroset, which again doesn't work if you're dealing with mushy horseradish. How are you dipping that? But if you have a lovely leaf, boom, into that haroset it goes, and it is there to cut out the danger of the bitterness while still allowing us to experience it. Very, very important. Now let's come back to the one that I've heard shouted over and over again, eggs. Excellent. Why? Yes, okay, that's what I expected. We can explain the shank bone, we can explain the bitter herb, we can explain the parsley, we can explain the matzah, we can explain the haroset, and then there is this lovely little white nodule on our plates, and everybody knows it belongs there, and very few of us understand why it's there. So today you are going to learn why we have an egg on the Seder plate. So first of all, have you ever heard of why there might be an egg on a Seder plate? Has anyone ever offered a hypothesis? The beginning of a new year. So nothing says new year like chicken ovulations. I mean, it's a nice theory, but, you know, there are lots of ways to symbolize beginnings. Why an egg of all things? Why would we have this on the table at all is the fundamental question. We got another hypothesis? The egg is potential of life. Again, ovulations, beautiful. Potential of life. It is there to show us what might be coming. The potential of spring, the potential of everything. Although nothing says killing potential like boiling it for 10 minutes and then putting it on a plate. Because there's no more potential for that egg except for being eaten. But in fact, we are missing... yes, one more? It's not just boiled, it is also roasted. And that is actually going to tease out the underlying idea. See, the underlying idea is actually the egg itself comes second to the role that it fills on the Seder plate. We're going to come back to why we picked an egg, but let's talk about the general role that that food item is filling, and the roasting gives us the hint. So cast your mind back to a couple thousand years ago when we still had the temple, or even earlier to the Mishkan, and we were offering sacrifices for Passover. Anybody who wants to know more about this, go check out my YouTube series in the Mishnah class talking about Passover in all of its bloody detail. Because those sacrifices were very important and very sanguine, and they took up a lot of the focus of that time. However, as important as that sacrifice was, there was a very real shortcoming in those lambs, and that's they were tiny. Right? The lambs that were used for the Passover offering were not giant 4-foot sheep that you might see in some field these days. They had not gone through the intensive animal husbandry process of creating the modern sheep, which is a weird aberration and deliberately human design. They were, tiny little lambs, the younglings of the parent lambs. They weren't even mutton yet. They were still just little lambs. And there wasn't a lot of meat on them. I mean that seriously. That if you were going to have a lamb, which was a little expensive, because you were killing an animal before it had become productive in other ways, and that was usually a costly choice if you were in an agrarian society, what you would do is you would go in with other people in the community. You would pitch in. You would have a co-op for your lamb. You would designate the lamb, and it would be for these 5, 6, 10 families, and that lamb was meant to serve 20, 30 people, 40 people, enough for Pesach. Well, guess what? There is not enough meat on a lamb to satisfy 40 people's appetite. Sorry, there's just not enough meat on the animal. But everybody is obligated to have the Passover sacrifice at the Seder. So, how do we make sure that no one goes home hungry, which would be one of the greatest sins from any Jewish event, that someone goes home hungry? You offer an additional sacrifice, what's known as the Chagiga sacrifice. The Chagiga was an additional sacrifice offered alongside of the actual lamb that would be the main event at the Passover meal. But that main event for the average attendee might be a piece of meat about that big. That's how much lamb you might actually get. Indeed, when we go through the Mishnah, there is a lot of discussion of exactly whether bits of gristle still count or whether it has to be a choicer cut. There is a great deal of argument about exactly how quality-wise meat you get, because they knew that an average person might be getting just something the size of an olive, which was one of the universal Jewish measurements of size. Well, if I'm only going to get an olive of lamb, I better have something else to eat. And that was where the Chagiga came in. The Chagiga was a different sacrifice that was offered alongside in order that you could also eat to your fill, that you could actually enjoy yourself, stuff yourself, feel good about what you had eaten from a gastronomical sense, because Judaism understands that filling our bellies is a good way of letting our souls sing out a little bit more loudly. We're not big on that whole aesthetic side of life. We do it a few times, but we don't want to make a habit of it. And so we wanted to have this extra offering. The egg is standing in for that extra offering. Because after all, we don't have the original lamb offering. That's the shank bone. So we need a stand-in for the Chagiga offering as well, that bonus meal offering. And that has come to be an egg. So now that we know why we have another cooked dish, indeed roasted dish, on that plate, now we are only left with the question, but why did we end up with an egg? Why not put a chicken bone over there, to go along parallel with the shank bone? Why not have a beef rib or something else to represent the Chagiga sacrifice? Because after all, there's one thing we know about eggs: they were never offered as a sacrifice at any point in Jewish history. Eggs never made it to the altar. Indeed, chickens never made it to the altars. As we saw in the reading today for the Torah, yes, some birds, most notably turtle doves or doves in general, did make it to the altar, but that was about it. But even for those, their eggs did not make it to the altar. So now we are left trying to understand why an egg became the symbol of the Chagiga offering that was there as the supplemental to the main sacrifice of Pesach. Everybody with me? Now you know why people don't stop to explain this during the Seder and just say, enjoy your egg. It takes a while. It takes a while. But think about how happy you're going to be when you're sitting at that Seder on Monday night and explaining to your friends and family why they're eating that egg, because you now know the secret. And they don't. Trust me, they don't. If you guys don't know, they probably don't know either. Okay, so why an egg? Well, there are a couple of explanations. The first is the most obvious and not a bad one. They're cheap and plentiful. That is to say, if you are talking to somebody living during the last 2,000 years who is in a less and less agrarian lifestyle, as Jews were forced out of land ownership due to the various laws of the countries that we lived in, then chickens were one thing that you probably could still have on stock. And chickens are very, very good for eggs. As the old adage went, if somebody is killing a chicken, then either the chicken or the owner is sick. Because chickens were better left alive producing eggs than they were being killed to become your food. And you only killed a chicken if you needed that extra meat for your chicken soup, or if it looked like that chicken had stopped laying and was not going to be much longer for this world, then you wanted to kill it before it fell over dead, because if it fell over dead, it'd no longer be kosher. So eggs were plentiful. They were cheap. They were a great way to supplement the main meal, which is fulfilling the exact point of the Chagiga sacrifice, that it is there to supplement the main meal. There are other explanations. One of my favorite is that the egg represents something unique within our cooking experiences, which is that most other foods out there, when you cook them, they break down. Indeed, cooking is a form of pre-digestion. That's one of the reasons why our brains have gotten so big through evolution, because we learned how to use fire to manipulate the food, and we can get more nutrients out of it because of cooking it. And most things, when you cook, they break down. What happens when you heat up an egg? It gets harder. It starts off soft and gushy, and the more you heat it, the less edible it gets to a certain extent. It becomes harder and harder until eventually it's a rubber ball. And this is often held up as a metaphor for the Jewish people, that when you subject us to the pressures of the world, when you subject us to the fires of persecution, we get stronger. We don't fall apart, we don't dissolve, we don't get digested by the world. We instead become more and more resilient, and indeed less fragile than we were without that pressure. But the third explanation is the one I think is probably the original and probably the real explanation of why an egg, above all of the things, even if we have enough money to afford different additional foods, why the egg remains. The egg as a food represents has a different role within Jewish culinary tradition. One, again, that in the modern world, many of us are not as aware of. But in the classic Jewish experience, when somebody was going through Shiva, when somebody had lost a loved one and they returned from the cemetery, their friends would have prepared a meal for them. And one of the main components of that meal was an egg. Eggs. Right? Eggs are considered to be food that you provide to a mourner, food that you provide to one who is in grief. Well, why would we be in grief when we stare at our Seder plate? After all, we are celebrating the liberation of our people from Egypt. Yes. But there is an elephant in the room? No. There is a lamb missing from the room. When we stare at the Seder plate, even with that shank bone, that reminder of this Passover sacrifice, we are reminded by the reminder that we don't actually have the Passover sacrifice. We see what is missing by what is there as a reminder. And why don't we have the Passover sacrifice? Because there's no temple. Because the center of our religious collective life is still destroyed. It is still in ruins. Now, yes, we now have Jerusalem, although that is obviously contested, but we do not have a fully restored temple, which would only come in the days of Mashiach, in the days when the world has finally recognized that there is a path to follow together collectively towards God, and that each may have their own traditions and ways, but that we are one human family, and the temple is meant to symbolize that. As many of our teachers have tried to explain, when the third temple is built, all nations will participate in its construction because they will recognize that it is for the benefit of all nations. We're not there yet. This year, more than most years, we recognize that we are not there yet. As we continue to mourn those who died in October 7th, as well as those who continue to die trying to defend Israel and bring those who perpetrated October 7th to justice, we can recognize that yes, we celebrate our sense of freedom and liberation. We can never take that away from Pesach, but that tableau in front of us, that plate in front of us, is still reminding us of a bitter current truth, not only the bitterness of the past. That we recognize in that egg, that symbol of mourning, alongside the missing actual Passover sacrifice, that the world is not yet complete, that we are not truly at peace. October 7th, for many people, I believe, was a wake-up call to that reality. Many of us had become so comfortable that we felt this was it. After all, what could Mashiach bring us that would be better than living in the 21st century in the freedom of many different democracies where the vast majority of Jews live? Well, it turns out that the 21st century is not exactly perfect. That there are still many, many problems, many, many tragedies that we will experience. That egg represents that incompleteness. That egg represents that, yes, we are seeking fullness, that additional food, but we are also still not entirely out of the shadow of catastrophe. Many people throughout the years have added new elements to their Seder plate, whether it be an orange, whether it be a glass of water for Miriam. There are many different rituals that get added, and they're fun and amazing to talk about. But how much better to look at something that is on the plate and has been there for thousands of years and recognize the truth and the lesson that it's been trying to teach us silently from its little eggy shell for all of that time. That yes, we celebrate Pesach. Yes, we celebrate our liberation. And yes, the world is not yet finished. That there is still this shadow of mourning that we must acknowledge. It may be only there in little egg form, but it is there to remind us of that nonetheless. This year, you can, of course, go through additional steps to remember those who are captive, those who have fallen in the defense of Israel, and the continued struggle that our people undergo against anti-Semitism. You can add empty chairs, you can add posters, you could have additional songs and leaflets. But I'd like you to also recognize that there on that plate, there is a silent witness to what we have endured for thousands of years. That it's been there this whole time. We all knew it was there, but we didn't know why. This year we need it more. This year, when you partake of your Seder and you see that egg, recognize it as a symbol of Jewish resilience, of Jewish adaptability, and of loss, but a loss that we will eventually, may it be speedily in our days, overcome for the good of us and the good of the world. Shabbat Shalom and Pesach Sameach.